He is a current National Geographic Explorer at Large. He won the first Geographic Society Research and Exploration Prize in 1997. In 2016, he has been named the Rolex National Geographic Explorer of the Year and included in Time magazine list of the world's 100 most influential people. So Lee, it's really an honor to having with us and to see that despite all the success, you are still at the beamline doing science, bringing samples, unique samples that you found in Africa, reminding us that probably we all come from this wonderful continent, and we are all eager to see what brings you here and your latest findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Let me just say that it's lovely to see people. I know with the COVID restrictions, we have to have these small live venues, and hello to everyone online, but it's lovely to again be talking to human beings in the audience instead of a screen. I also have to say that I am not playing Iron Man up here from the Marvel comics. This keeps the camera on me for the Zoom, if anyone's wondering what the large blue light on my chest is. I have a long relationship with the ESRF and the synchrotron. I've been through 3 of the beamlines now, with my experiments dating back to the first visits in 2010. And it's an extraordinary pleasure to see the constant pushing of technology and science that goes on here. And I'm in awe of all of you that have the privilege of working here. It just feels like a privilege to even visit. I'm on an experimental trip to 2 countries. First was Denmark, where we're looking for ancient proteins and potentially ancient DNA, and now down here. And you'll see a little bit of those experiments as I go. I want to do something a little different, though, for this lecture than I would normally give just the sort of adventure of discovery that we're always undertaking. My teams number about 160 collaborating scientists worldwide. And obviously, things have dramatically changed in the first 2 years, but I want to take you back before I talk about what's happened in the last 2 years and where we're going in the future to the period before, and talk about this amazing time we're in right now. I am a paleoanthropologist. I look at human origins. I try to discern, particularly in Africa, where ancient humans came from, where they were, what they were like, and how they relate to us and the origin of modern humans ultimately. The last decade or so has been the most extraordinary period in this field. It's been extraordinary largely because of the advent of this super technology like the synchrotron here and its application to fossils like this, the rise of molecular biology, ancient proteins, ancient DNA, that are allowing us to test many of the questions that we probably thought were untestable in the past. But also at the same time, it's been the greatest period of discovery in the history of this science. Prior to about a decade ago, most scientists would have told you we understood how human evolution worked in a broad sense. They would have talked about how these were some of the rarest sought after objects on the planet, the fossils of these ancient human relatives, and that the narrative was going to be relatively slow. But the last decade has proven them wrong. And we have never been in a period of discovery like we've been in now, combined with this extraordinary moment of rise of technology that's allowing us to turn what was maybe almost a science that resembled stamp collecting a lot to something that has now testable questions that we can pursue, and that's only going to get better in the future. I want to go back to the before times, and you all know what I'm talking about when I say the before times, before 2 years ago. In fact, the ESRF was my last scientific visit when I was here for the conference just before COVID hit. And in fact, as I left on the airplane from Lyon, they announced the first case in Paris. So it's kind of a strange thing to be back here full circle watching a room full of people in masks. That wasn't like that before. My teams and I over the last decade or so have had the sort of adventure of a scientific lifetime. The first part of this, after spending 17 years in in Africa looking for even the smallest remains of human origins, and I was pretty much failing at that. Although I was having other great discoveries, I was not making those big discoveries. And so I suppose it was appropriate that after discovering a site on using Google Earth, my then 9-year-old son, Matthew, said, "Dad, I found a fossil," and my life would change forever from that moment on. That fossil was part of an extraordinary series of discoveries. And Francesco alluded to this wonderful skull, which is the skull of Australopithecus sediba, which was a new species we named in 2010 after scanning it here at the synchrotron. And we would recover other skeletons of this species. And literally, it became one of the most important discoveries of ancient humans for a period of time in Africa. We were all living the scientific dream as my team grew from basically one person, me, to over 100 people within a period of about 2.5 years. It was extraordinary. We had papers in all the papers you could wish in places like Science and Nature. It was an extraordinary time. And one of the things that was a result of that is we were working and publishing on this remarkable fossil series. It was 2 million years old. We had some of the most accurate dates that had ever been recovered. We were using these technologies to look inside of this species in a way other scientists hadn't been able to. And I was also able to explore the ideas of open access and open sharing, which I had always been passionate about, but had been fairly rare within this field. But I had also, during that same period, quit exploring. I'd stopped going out in the field because, once you've made the discovery of a lifetime within this field, you're not going to make another discovery. But it's a little bit like that old story of, it's incredibly unlikely to win the lottery twice. It's in fact impossible. It's certainly certain if you don't buy a second lottery ticket. And for people like us, exploration is that second lottery ticket. And that would come along for me with Homo naledi, which was a discovery that was made as I sent teams back out to look at my Google Earth maps, and particularly underground, and we would make a discovery in a deep cave system that I could never go into. At the bottom of a 12-meter shaft that narrowed down to about 17 centimeters in width, about 120 meters into a cave system, was this discovery lying on the floor. And I needed to find scientists. I needed a new way of exploring where I couldn't just lead an expedition. So I put a Facebook ad out to find young scientists around the world, skinny scientists, who could actually fit into this. And that would start the Rising Star expedition after I found these remarkable qualified scientists, most qualified scientists and explorers in the world, with special skills that could get into this remote and dangerous area in this cave that was called the Rising Star Cave System. The expedition was an extraordinary success. As we launched it just a month after I saw the first images from in that cave, we were doing a thing that other people hadn't really done. We were using remote cameras to talk to people. I sort of modeled it on deep sea exploration and space exploration, because I had to sit in the command center with other scientists, and we would work with these explorers underground in this remote, dangerous area. We also did other things like live streamed it to the world. Had over 1 million followers over the period of an expedition, which was both exciting and terrifying because we didn't know what we were going to find. And these are some of these images that earned these people the name underground astronauts during that period. It was an extraordinary adventure. And you can see, I think, by the look on the faces of these young scientists, the kind of emotions as we discovered the richest fossil hominid deposit ever discovered in the history of the search for human origins in Africa. These are the kind of conditions and kind of images that we were seeing and beaming to the world that they were working in these small cave areas. But these fossils were not preserved in a typical way. They were literally just lying in dirt, and we would actually just take them out of dirt. This is just a tiny part of the collection after the first expedition, where we collected something over 1,500, 1,600 individual remains. Now, that may not sound like a lot to you for some fields, but that equaled pretty much the total record of ancient human relatives that had been discovered in subequatorial Africa prior to that, and almost equaled the whole record that comes from places like East Africa. So it was an extraordinary thing. And it was an enigmatic species. that had a small brain. It looked very primitive, but the condition of its discovery didn't look very primitive. And we would eventually announce to the world that it was a species that was a new species we'd never seen. We had almost 24 individuals of it after the initial work that we had, and it existed at the wrong time. It existed what should have been 2 million or 2.5 million years old. It existed at about 250,000 to 300,000 years ago, and thus was a contemporary of what we thought were modern humans. And we had them in many places, not just the first chambers we worked in. Ultimately, we would find them in up to 9 other places within the cave system, including skeletons like this, all in highly abnormal situations, which ultimately we would controversially say was because we felt this small-brained, non-human species was actually deliberately disposing of its dead. And that was a very controversial thing to say because modern humans don't even do that until maybe 200,000 years after this event took place. But that was a hypothesis that's still in the process, and I'll give you a little bit of enlightenment to that at the end of this talk. We used new ways of working with this. I enlisted particularly early career scientists, many of whom have never worked on original hominid material before because they were restricted from working it. Mine was a field where really, unless you were a discoverer of fossils and part of an elite group of senior scientists, the chances are you would never get to, the opportunity to work on primary material to describe it. And I put together large teams, large diverse teams from all over the world, and we described this material to, I think, great success. And there's been something like 60 or 70 papers now on Homo naledi just from our teams, and many, many more from other scientists that work on it. We were applying both primitive technology that I call that primitive, of course, it's not that primitive, but also advanced technology like synchrotron to explore these fossils in ways that had never been done before. You'll all recognize scientists like Paul Taffero, where we brought this in one of the very first hominids to ever be scanned in front of, I think, the old ID-17 beamline at that time with spectacular results that allowed us to both look inside of these in a way and at levels that no humans had before to explore fossils like this, but also to share them with the public with visuals that were striking and extraordinary and moving people as we did that. And those that work here are not excited particularly by images like this, but they certainly excited the world as we showed them not only how the front end of technology at that time could be applied to the search for human origins. So I had designed at that time, we're going now back to 2017, 2018, 2019, perhaps the worst type of exploration and lab work team you could ever design if a pandemic was going to hit. As we moved from 2018, 2019, we were living as if everything was a success. We were publishing 20, 30 scientific papers a year. The teams would fly in for 5, 10 days. Scientists would travel into South Africa. We would work on this material. Our exploration teams were in these dark, crowded spaces, close together, humid environments, working together, moving through these spaces. We were making discovery after discovery, and it was perfect. Everything was great. But probably your pandemic brain shudders now as you look at images like that, which were, if you, as I said earlier, had probably tried to design something terrible for a pandemic of exploration that you wanted to continue, that kind of work would do it. And that went on into the labs. We had these large open plan labs with people sitting right next to each other, collaborating with each other, working with each other in these relatively unventilated environments. It was brilliant for the moment, and it was terrible when that came along. In fact, it shut us down completely. Almost every aspect of what I had designed over that decade of discovery and exploration was unsuitable in any way for a pandemic environment. As all of you know, South Africa went into a particularly hard lockdown, one of the hardest in the world. But luckily, I had had a little inkling, and it was because I had come here to the ESRF, and I'd spoken to people both here and on the way back with people, for example, people that I met at Emirates who suggested that this was going to be a terrible thing. And so as it was happening, back there in February 2020, March 2020, I began to move my people out from these environments. I began to move them out into the field. We had now realized that there was going to be a change, and that I needed to recognize very quickly that this was going to be a new normal. Now, this was back in February, March, April, when everyone was still unsure. I remember saying in meetings where people said, it's just the flu. Oh, we all wish that were true right now, right? And I started, as we moved into these hard lockdowns, saying, what can I do right now with these teams? How can we keep working even under a lockdown scenario? Particularly with the impossible sort of exploration ideas and lab work that I'd created in that successful 10-year period. And so ultimately the idea was to say, okay, all of that's now gone. We can't do that now. And now let's get creative and find another way to do it. And one easy way, during lockdown at least, was to begin communicating science. A lot of our stuff isn't out there in the way, and I think many scientists, many of us are guilty of keeping our processes and what we're doing behind relatively closed doors. And I think many of us are aware that that has probably not been a particularly good thing for science, and we're seeing the result of that lack of communication even under COVID as people distrust science, often because they can't see it. So I started looking at ideas of how to communicate science even under lockdown. And so I put up with my university the idea of exploring within our hominid vaults in a place where I could go alone. And yes, I had to learn to do things like edit everything myself, film myself, have terrible audio all the time, and do all the things you do, but start taking people into a space that they would not normally do it and occupy our time by creating content. Because I also felt back there naively in mid-2020 that this would be opening up by the end of 2020 and people would need content because they wouldn't have been able to prepare content for their lectures and labs. And so I was busy creating these sort of things. I think we were all growing things like COVID hair at that time. Creating other types of content for scientists to work with, like the Fossil Vault Instagram page, where I would bring high quality images of both discoveries as they're being made, but also images that could be used for research in science, high quality research. And this was how I was beginning to get an idea of how we could blend in this new model as we were all learning to use Zoom and Teams and all of those sort of things. I was also, we were probably one of the only groups that actually built and opened a museum during COVID. But we were able to completely adapt our designs and adapt the way we were doing that to a COVID-friendly environment. So we sectioned off the areas so that groups that were together could move through museums. This museum is about Malapa, where Sediba was discovered, and was designed to be built on small numbers of visitors and still maintain viable in safe environments rather than the kind of large visitor museums, many of which still haven't opened around the world. And this, in fact, has opened. As we move towards the middle and then latter parts of 2020, I want to get back in the field, though. That is the bread and butter of what my teams do in the field and what had built our success. But as I said, I had built this terrible, terrible idea of a way to explore in a pandemic environment. We couldn't do that. And so I decided to change the way we were doing that, and met some resistance, by the way. Met resistance from the bureaucracies and universities because people felt if we got back in the field, then others would want to get back in the field too, which seems like a strange complaint to it. But I had things like these. These were field school huts, and I knew there weren't going to be any field schools in a very long time. So I actually converted those field school huts into laboratories because they could be created in safe spaces. And we could create isolated small areas to actually work within these environments. We went through new training that we invented of ways that we could have outdoor work. And I think we're all familiar with those sort of things now, but safety training and different ways of working in this COVID environment, but also moving people in the field so that the job could continue. We did strange things like taking the vehicle pools. We had a large pools of field vehicles, but I couldn't let people ride together, which sounds like a strange thing to do, but it's critical to move people. So we actually put our vehicles in stationary, and I actually paid people to come to work. And I know that sounds strange, but it actually resulted in a cost saving that we never realized was there. So people went separately. So if anyone got COVID, you could isolate them and keep them away. Strange things like that, which were innovations that we're now going to implement on a more permanent basis within the system. We installed technology, cameras, so that scientists around the world and myself and others and the technicians themselves could communicate with each other. We could walk through, and you see the large numbers of cameras that would allow us to work right in the spaces that they are. We could talk with them and communicate with them at any time as the preparation went on, and any scientist could do that anywhere in the world. This was really groundbreaking. It actually raised the morale and pride of the people doing the preparation as they watch people work with them and watch them actually work in these environments. And there you can see the different types of individual labs that were set up all over. And our productivity actually tripled from pre-pandemic. Our productivity in preparation, which was a strange phenomena of people really wanting to get back to work and then working in these environments they felt comfortable in and safe in that we had created. And then it came down to, okay, we've handled the idea of preparation, we've handled the laboratory work, and that's going on, but how can we get into sites? I showed you images which are entirely inappropriate to work within a pandemic environment in these deep caves. And so I went looking for a site that could be worked during these. And one of them happened to be about 250 meters away from the Rising Star site. But it was a site that my teams had made a discovery in back in 2014, just after Rising Star had occurred. But it was an impossible cave to work in. It was a huge cave, you can see that here, but the entrance areas where you actually walked in were dangerous. They had been blasted 120 years ago by miners. It was just a place that you could work. And the fossils that we had discovered were actually out of context. It was one little mandible with two teeth in it. And it just came actually from right over there where that yellow light is, you can see in the back there. And there was nothing else around it. There'd actually been a movie, Tremors, had been filmed in this, and there's graffiti from that movie all over the wall. And it was a place that I had never thought could really produce anything. But I was looking at the situation saying, how can we actually change this? As I went to the cave saying, how could I use this as a COVID environment to actually work in? And I looked over at this little pile of rock right where you see here, right about where that little light is. I turned over one rock and there was this innocuous thing. Now, you guys look at that and go, well, that's nothing. For me, it was the first rock I turned over had a hominid tooth in it. That's one hominid tooth, and it had all these other bones. I was looking in the first rock I'd turned over. And by the way, we had explored this cave for 3 years, not seeing anything. We had mapped this cave for 3 years and not seen anything. And the first rock during COVID that I turned over had this in it that you would prepare. And now you can begin to see the type of thing that was coming out. You can see the other bones of what was a partial skeleton coming in there. This was spectacular. But still, how could we actually work this site? So I decided to fix the problem of going in under the damaged roof. We would actually go in a completely different way into this. Luckily, my preparators, I'd moved out in the field and they were right next to it. So we had all the mapping done and everything. And I decided to do something completely new and different that I'd never done before. One, I would build a staircase to get in there. I would come in from the opposite side away from the dangerous areas. And here you can see that staircase that we put in. It's actually just a fire escape. It was built in. The reason I put that in was because I knew we couldn't work under this sort of overhang environment. It would be too dangerous ultimately in the long term. So what we decided to do was, instead of working inside of the cave as we typically would do in close contact, we would move the cave from the inside to the outside. And that's what we did. We literally built a replica of the cave. Outside of the cave, we hired people who were unemployed during that period, and the unemployment was terrible in South Africa. During COVID, we hired large groups of people. We trained them, and we literally carried every single rock that was inside the cave, mapped it, and brought it to the outside, and reconstructed the cave underground, and immediately began to prepare the fossils that came out of that. It also had me enlist all of these young scientists who were trapped with me here in South Africa. Normally, in the model that I had built before, largely it was dominated by the people, the senior scientists who could quickly come in. They would engage, of course, students and early career scientists, but they tended to dominate this. But here I had these teams of people who were available in country with us, and they became the project leaders. They began leading the big ideas and the implementation and the way forward in this unusual environment that none of us had ever been in. And so we had this empowerment going on of early career scientists leading the projects in a way that probably wouldn't have happened naturally in the pre-COVID world. And here you can see the different type of work we were doing. We had to adapt to work with PPE underground and all of those type of things that everyone's familiar with, but it was worth it. We began to find first a few fossils like this one, then others like this one. Then we began to find post-cranial fossils, and we built a shed and we sorted these fossils in it. And we started realizing that once again, we discovered another of the richest fossil hominid sites in the world. And so you can see all of this is hominid material that you're looking at. And this is from about 6 months back. So right now we're sitting at something like 100 individual hominid elements from this 105 site that occurred. So we ended up with this incredibly rich discovery. That was totally surprising. In a period, in a place that was right next to where we'd all been working, everyone had explored already. And it showed me, and I learned this lesson about actually continuing the exploration activities, but not just exploring, but doing as well. Because we need to actually get into these sites to see what they remain, to suddenly find out that these fossils may not be the rarest sought after objects on the planet. As I mentioned, the investment in local people has been profound. Local scientists has been profound, where we're grabbing these young people and thrusting them into leadership roles, getting practical training in the middle of these discoveries, and also training them in a way to be creative in their scientific solutions. One of the brilliant things as a lab leader and a team leader for me has been the way COVID has taken off the kind of gloves of the kind of constraints that we used to have, and figuring out ways to solve problems. So for example, we used to send our material for dating to collaborating labs overseas. Well, that wasn't practical now because often it had to be hand carried. So now we invested in a local geochronology lab, built it at pennies on the dollar of what it normally would cost, and now are able to do our own dating in-house with our own collaborators here. Also building a generation of new young explorers, people who are beginning to get the mindset of discovery and are able to take leadership positions. People like Dr. Kanoe Molopane, Dr. Tebogo Makabela are in fact right now this week, as we say, and I'm going back to this, opening up 2 new fossil sites themselves, being the first young Black PIs, principal investigators in the region, and all as a result of this. All as a result of this work being invested in South Africa that might not have happened for them for several years, if not a decade or more from now. And they're learning to collaborate with these overseas scientists who are effectively trapped out of this. We're just beginning to see the first scientific visitation that's actually occurring. And the South African public responded to this. They were watching this as we were working with social media and being live with this material. And they started seeing these scientists also as super scientists, as leading a next generation of young scientists. And all of that coming out of the COVID environment that we were beginning to see successes in the field, and then becoming a face of the next generation of science in a way that has never happened before. And all of this, I do attribute to the changes that were occurring because of COVID, because we were kind of into a rut of success. We were into a line of success that was hard to get out of. COVID forced us to do. And there you can see, by the way, the cave built on the outside. And here you can see the type, this is done for a regional TV show that was featuring the work of these extraordinary young people. We're also investing in other ways of working with technology from abroad and doing the technological work there and sharing that and the kind of things that you guys are all familiar with. For example, this, by the way, is a block containing the whole rest of the skeleton of Karabo, the skull skeleton that you saw initially, and will be the most complete hominid ever discovered. This block will, as promised, come. As soon as the BM18 beamline, which if you haven't seen it, is extraordinary here, has the carriage to take something of this weight, we are going to bring that here and scan and then leave for future scientists an untouched specimen within its original context, something we didn't have the luxury to do, and something that synchrotron has leadership in around the world. This specimen, this science that we're working on right now, is actually here in Grenoble at this moment. We finished the experiment yesterday. It was a discovery made by seeing on CT scan initially those spaces behind the skull. You can see the skull of Sediba. And when we extracted those, we found what appeared to be morphologically fossil hominid skin, dating 2 million years old. That will be the oldest hominid skin, if it is skin. But the simple microscopic work and molecular work are not satisfactory to prove to the world at that level that this really is. And so we came here to work with the synchrotron, the new BM18 line, and that was scanned yesterday. And hopefully what we're going to see is the anatomy of fossilized skin and what lies underneath, the hair follicles, perhaps hairs themselves, and see how far we can take that with understanding what is a remarkable fossil situation and something only done here. And here's just a little look at some of the anatomy. You can see what appear to be blood vessels and hair follicles that are present within a system like that. I'm hoping to see this down at 6.5 microns within the next few weeks. And I'm pleased to say we're going to be partnering WITS NESRF with a postdoc that will actually be based here to actually do this kind of work in this practical work. In this location here, we recovered also an extraordinary skeleton of a young child of Homo naledi a few years ago. We extracted it entirely, and we're doing investigations of that block here at the synchrotron. And what we're going to be doing is taking medical scans that we did of this, and I'll show some of those in a moment, and we're going to be taking that to an unprecedented level with resolution in some areas of 6.5 microns across the entirety of this block. And this block is about 70 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters wide. Something impossible to scan anywhere else in the world was just scanned this week here at BM18. And the results of that are going to allow us to leave a skeleton in situ, where you can see the quality of preservation inside that block is like this. And this is with medical CT. And I can tell you, I've already seen some of the images that came out of BM18. We can do everything that we could do with an excavated specimen with BM18, but leaving this for future generations, future molecular studies. And I'll give you an idea of why we're excited. This is a skeleton sitting inside of that block that was scanned here. And we're going to get the ability to separate out every one of these and other things that are in there in a way that is unprecedented. And the postdoc is going to be dedicated to this probably for the next year. There are literally going to be a flood of high impact papers that come out of this, and the unprecedented idea that we're leaving this for future generations instead of destructively sampling. That's something only synchrotron has been able to do. And by the way, we tried to do this work in other places that were more easily accessible, and it all failed. But I've seen that it hasn't failed here, which is a great thing. We've also gone back in and learned different ways of exploring in those really, really remote areas. And I just want to give you an idea of the kind of remote areas that our explorers are in now, and exploring in COVID, but safely, apart from each other with safety features in. And those have resulted in new discoveries. Some of you may have seen things like the little Leti fossil that we described, a little child's head of a non-human species of animal set on a shelf in a place that human beings almost can't get to, all alone, no body, and we don't know why it's there. But again, sometimes the mysteries are as fun in science as the answers that we get. But just a few points to kind of summarize this on. I built a program of multinational collaboration, and it is absolutely clear that that is the only way to do world-class science. We need collaborations across the world, and we need to change the way that those work. The idea of parachute science, where you quickly jump on your plane, I promise you, I've been on several planes in the last 2 weeks, and fly down and then leave again, is gone, at least for the foreseeable future. And in that place, we need to build a new way to continue that excellence, where partners are building extraordinary things that we can't do, like here, and we're doing extraordinary things differently there and able to share them across platforms. And to reiterate, that has redefined the idea of what international collaboration means. It also means that we need to invest in those communication technologies, not just Zoom and Teams, but the ability to transfer these large data sets, the STL files produced, and the ability to work together across these areas. And that has to be a priority of the future, because the age of just easily moving that stuff about is not going to. And we need to work with ideas of open access and those sort of things, which I think are positive outcomes of COVID. We also need to take a lesson from what we were doing and invest regionally where your data sets are. If your data sets are coming from Africa or India or China or wherever they're coming from, somewhere outside of the developed areas you're in, we need to invest in regional infrastructure that is pandemic proof so that we continue to work, as an example. Throughout the entire pandemic, we were producing data that other scientists will be collaborating with and working on. There's a lesson in that. We're doing it not in an expensive way. We're doing it in an affordable way, but scientists who are based and are data dependent on these areas need to strongly look at investing in the areas where the discoveries or where the primary data is actually recovered. And of course, it highlights the need for creative multidisciplinary thinking and problem solving. We can't be afraid to just get on with the work. And we do need to get on the work. We're all scientists. We need to make advances. And there's every reason to sit down and go, well, this is going to be over in a few months. Don't think like that. It's not going to be over in a few months. Build your systems, build your labs, build your exploration, build your experiments for a world that's going to be like this. Because I'll tell you what, when we all do get to take the masks off, that'll be a better system. Anyway, as you move forward within this area. And this, just to reiterate this, because I really think it's hugely important, that we need to develop these strong scientific capacity in those local regions. I think you need, and I'm speaking here to also people who have the ability to give grants in that. And one advantage that I think that I saw coming out of that is that there probably are going to be more grants available for particularly field work and exploration, because most grant agencies are still holding on to their 2020 grants that weren't actually spent by teams. And so if you have field work, if you have the ability to go out in the field, I think it's an excellent time to actually apply for those type of grants to get back out in the field, because I think there's actually quite a lot of resources floating around that went unspent during the 2020, 21, and even now into 2022. And we should see that as a positive opportunity to move our sciences forward. So to summarize, as horrible as this pandemic has been to the cost of human life, as horrible as it has been to society and our social lives and all of the things, and I think we all know there are going to be ramifications, particularly amongst young people in future generations. There are also bright parts to it. There are parts that we need to see as positive and move the science forward in a better and more productive way. And I think the work that our teams are doing in South Africa, making big discoveries, making another big discovery during the time of this and successfully learning to navigate that are at least an exemplary or an example of what that kind of opportunity is. I can't show pictures like this too much because what the result of that investment regionally is going to be the investment of permanent scientists from those regions representing those science, doing world-class science. And that is always going to be a win-win. We're now building new types of facilities just for this. We're building laboratories in the wilderness regions that can be worked in remotely for all different types that are built to be variable for all different types of experiments, whether it be live animal capture and studies or other things, to build opportunities for this type of research in the future, because we believe that is going to be the future of scientific research. Summarize, I believe passionately, now is the time to do high risk, high reward science. The scientific community is hungry for it. We're all hungry for it. And again, I guess the final message, never stop exploring. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Lee, for this fascinating and so insightful presentation. I come close to you just to be in the field of views. Otherwise, it's a weird voice coming from nowhere. So we can now go on to the question part of the colloquium, and to the people on Zoom. I invite you, you are much welcome to ask your questions to Lee Berger in the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom window. So while you do that, maybe we can start with questions from the auditorium. Would like to ask a question. Please move to a microphone, press on the button.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk, and thank you for the job you've done.
Thank you.
I have just a little technical question. I would like to ask about the dating of those fossils, because carbon dating cannot go that far. And how would you date the fossil that is just lying in the cave? Thank you.
So that's a great question. You're absolutely right. Carbon dating really isn't much use over 40, 45,000 years, particularly in these high carbonate environments where you get false signals. It used to be thought that the South African caves weren't datable, but we had significant breakthroughs over the last 15 or so years, particularly in areas related to uranium lead dating, which is and we date the flowstone formation. So the calcium carbonate formations, you get a clock reset, and you can use uranium lead dating to do that. And if we can get bounding situations, we can actually come up with reasonable dates. In the case of Homo naledi, which were lying on the ground, it was an extraordinarily difficult task. There is a paper in eLife that you can look up to see the various methods we applied. We were lucky enough that there was a thin flowstone layer that had a bone lying under it, which allowed us the cap to date. And then we had some underlying areas that were pre the formation that bound it. We also were able to apply things like electron spin resonance dating directly to the fossils themselves. And we came up with a cohesive series of dates. In fact, the Homo naledi fossils themselves are probably some of the worst dated fossils, because the actual date we published is about 230,000 years to 330,000 years. So it's like a 30% error in the entire window in the entire time. We have had some breakthroughs recently in other dating methods like uranium helium, which Teboho Makabela was involved in the invention along with Jan Kramers in South Africa that are going to allow us to refine those. Things like Sediba were a little bit easier, largely because of luck. They were bounded between two datable flow stones, and we had a magnetic reversal that occurred between them. And we were incredibly fortunate, and it gave us one of the most precise dates for an early hominid ever of 1.977 million years plus or minus 3,000 years, which is a very good date. The new 105 site, which is that site I was showing you of the new material, we actually have a preliminary date on. I'm not going to tell you what that is. We're going to publish it first, but I'm also waiting on a double blind. I always do double blinds with dating teams. I create two dating teams so that we can be assured that the methods, differing methods will correlate with each other without the influence of sort of possible laboratory corrections coming into the assessments.
More questions from the room? Francisco? Move to.
Thanks, Leo. It's great. One question. I mean, hominid fossils sounded very rare only 10 years ago. But from what you show and what the feeling is that they're not so rare.
No.
So, not so rare in South Africa. But is this, what's your feeling? Are we going to discover more maybe in other continent? Why Africa was so specific to being the cradle of humankind? Is this some kind of a better picture of the evolution of humankind emerging out of these studies?
That's a great question, Francesco. And I think there are two separate answers to that. I think we're seeing from discoveries in the archaeological record, the paleoanthropological record, the molecular record across the world, that there was some reason that we stopped exploring. Something, maybe it was a generational thing, had confined exploration to just a relatively few teams in these fields. And what I think is emerging is the next generation that got out there again and went to places where people said there wasn't anything and started making discoveries again, because we have seen an explosion of discoveries. I mean, hardly a week goes by without a transformational discovery being announced in this broad field. And so I think there really was a sort of psychology of everything's been found, these things are rare, so I even look for them. And I think that's going away slowly within it. Another part to your answer is, I don't think it's somewhere like Southern Africa. I don't think it's actually where we're looking. This was the most explored area, as you know, on the entire continent, and went 70 years without hardly anything. And then boom, all of a sudden, it was right in front of it. And it's largely because we started looking. I don't know if you've ever heard this sort of old English adage of, you know, someone sees a drunk walking around under a street light at night, going round and round, and they go, "Why are you there?" And he said, "I dropped my car keys." And they say, "Well, what, you dropped them here?" And he said, "No, over there, but the light's better here." It's where we're looking right now. I think that as we expand that explorer gene and breed that explorer gene and fund exploration, again, we're going to see this repeated across Africa, across Europe, across Asia, everywhere. I think there are tremendous discoveries to be made in the old world and the new world in this as we take those blinkers off. No, I don't think hominid fossils are rare at all. In fact, right now, if you want really rare fossils, look for fossils of, you know, carnivores in South Africa. They're much rarer than are. And I think that trend's going to continue, and the quality of evidence is going to continue to grow as we move into this next period.
Thank you. Well, until we have further questions from the room, we can move to questions from the online audience.
Sure.
And we have a question from Uli Köster, who says, great talk, etc. What are alternative explanations to the strongly clustered occurrence of hominid fossils? And he also asked whether there are any hints of prehistoric pandemics.
Trace, what's the last bit?
Pandemia.
Oh, so I think I partially answered the idea of where that I think it's largely where we're looking right now. I think that the discovery is going to be widespread. I think the evolution of hominids was broad and introgressed, and that there are going to be many, many new things and species discovered. And the second was really about
whether there are any hints of prehistoric pandemic.
Prehistoric pandemics. I don't know, but I would probably say, well, we're not going to find that level of evidence, but I don't believe that anymore. I mean, I just saw some pretty remarkable stuff happen in Copenhagen that you guys will see in a year or so, or maybe less. Normally I would say, well, that kind of stuff doesn't fossilize. I'm not sure that stuff doesn't fossilize anymore. And I think that as we move into this exciting world of molecular biology, ancient molecular biology, and synchrotron will play a role in that for sure. As we move into that, I think nothing's out of the question.
Thank you. So we have a question now from Jody Sempere, who congratulates you for your talk, and then says your team is making great discoveries, and further ones would be possible if more scientists would have access to the data. And ask whether the database data sets will be made available to every scientist.
So, great question, and I'm very proud to say that our team, I think, have been quite reasonable leaders in the idea of open access to data. Every single fossil we publish, the data sets are made completely open access. You can see the fossils prior to publication, you can study them. And we also make all of the shape files, all of the 3D measurements, all of the CT scans, all the synchrotron scans freely available online. You can go on a place called morphosource.org, which is a jointly hosted thing by Duke University. And you can download every fossil we've ever published. And you can have your 10-year-old check the measurements or check the information that we put out. So the answer is absolutely. I'm a firm believer in the idea of, I don't use the word though open access, I'll be fair. I call it open collaboration, because I think it's critically important that scientists who just approach data actually look where that data came from and try to build greater development with the groups in the countries where that data is originating. Now, this speaks very specifically to things like paleontology and paleoanthropology, which are often the data is coming from the developing world. But so I like the word open collaboration better than open access.
Thank you. Then we have an anonymous guest who asks you, what are you using as a marker for detecting skin in the samples you're investigating?
So the very first marker that we had was visual one, where you literally, we have quite a lot of this stuff. Some of it's attached to hominids and some of it's to non-hominids. It visually looks like skin. That's kind of the obvious marker where it started, where we saw it. We then started with surface landscape studies, microscopic studies, visual studies of that. And we try to do a little bit of invasive work, geochemistry, kind of classic sedimentology. Within that, there's a lovely thesis on the skin from Malapa by Dr. Rachel Keeling. You can actually look it up online and see the work we did. But the problem that we have in the early days of this is very similar to what dinosaur researchers faced when they first started talking about feathers in dinosaurs, where people didn't believe they existed. And so the first ones had to rise to a very, very high level of evidentiary nature to actually be proved. And so, and now, everyone accepts that dinosaurs had feathers, and you don't have to go to that level really anymore. And we're kind of at that level, and that's why we're here. with these specimens. We're going to do an anatomical micro safari through this material with the hopes of seeing and shaping and visualizing anatomical structures in a 2 million year old rock.
I would like to ask you a question that I've been thinking of since a long time. In spite of the progress in the discoveries of specimens that you've reported, and that's really fascinating, one still has to consider only a few individuals. And so do you have a way of understanding what is specific to an individual and what is generic to the population? Because maybe that's what is more interesting to us.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's a great question. And individuals are very important. Individuals are representative of the populations they exist in. But I wholeheartedly hear you. You know, some of the things that have been changing is, you know, with Homo naledi, for example, I believe we're now approaching probably 30 individuals, and we could probably double that number tomorrow if we chose to. We're actually leaving things in place. 30 individuals is beginning to deal with a statistical level population you can actually deal with. I think that's going to happen for most of these fossils as we see exploration continuing. And I think that we have to balance the sort of science of individuals and their position and role and representation of a population. But we are, in some cases, Neanderthals are another, where we are actually developing populations that we can examine outlier individuals within against those. And I think that's only going to get better.
Thank you. And by the way, do we have any way of, say, estimate how many hominids were living, say, in South Africa at the time of Sediba?
I don't think we have that kind of handle on that.
Are we speaking of thousands or many more?
Oh,
or
no,
100,000?
You know, I've seen low numbers in the tens of thousands and people who go up from there. A lot has to do with, we don't really often have a handle of what the niches of these are. They localized to certain geographies and certain sort of environmental niches? Are they kind of like humans? Are they widespread across a wide variety? Those two answers would have a big difference between, you know, are they in the population levels of mountain gorillas? Or are they in the population levels of low density hunter-gatherer type humans? And those numbers are vastly far apart from each other. But I wouldn't be surprised if many of these species existed in hundreds of thousands at any one time in the past.
Thank you. Back to online questions. We have a guest named Greg who asks you whether those intense X-rays could cause any damage at the molecular level that could affect future analysis.
That's a great question, Greg, and one we think about deeply. And in fact, every single specimen that we scan, we either keep parts of that specimen out of the high energy X-ray beams away from that, just for that. Now, we also at the same time are doing studies. Most of those studies indicate that you have to get into even more extraordinary energy levels than we're actually hitting most of these were to do any damage. But given that there's even the potential of that for particularly ancient DNA, ancient proteins are probably pretty rugged, but again, for the same reasons, we always keep samples away from it, or we scan only part of it. And that's a big, by the way, a big advantage of a beamline like BM18, which is able to actually very discreetly keep its radiation in line. And you have very little spillover radiation at the higher energy levels, which is a big advantage of synchrotron radiation. Absolutely. So there is the possibility of it. We take precautions to preserve data for future research.
We have a question from Henry Fisher, who writes, it's a lengthy question, sorry. One often claims to have discovered new species based on morphological difference with other hominids, but do that extend to take into account morphological differences between individual and given species? So maybe you already commented on that. And then he says, for example, it has been reasoned based on morphology that Neanderthal was a different species than Sapiens, but now there is strong evidence they were interbreeding.
So a lot of that, that's an ongoing debate and will be an ongoing debate into the next 50 years on what first is the definition of a species. We don't even have a definition of what it is to be human. I mean, think of that. There isn't a definition for what it is to be human. That's part of the problem. Maybe we should do that and then start with these other things, and then it'd be easier to define some of them. There are all different ways of defining species. There are morphological ways, and there are people who, like me, who say if you're going to do morphology, it needs to be whole body morphology, but that often isn't realistic in a fossil record. It's often very fragmentary. There are others who are happy to use isolated characters, and you can end up with mixing. Things like Homo naledi, where you have a relatively large population of what we're fairly confident are close temporal relations of each other, show almost no variation, almost zero variation, making us wonder whether some of the variation is geographical or population driven that we see. I can tell you that if you found one part of Homo naledi, you would probably place it phylogenetically very differently than if you found another part of it, and that complexifies it. Molecular biology is adding to that and both complexifying it and adding solutions at the same time. Neanderthals appear to be a morphologically discrete from the whole population of living modern humans. Yet we find integration with them between, say, 0.5 and 5% in many humans on the planet. So there was interbreeding going on. But the idea of things like mate recognition and the idea of different species can't interbreed has sort of gone away quite a long time ago. It just hovers around in everyone's mind. I think species are useful to have, but I think there's a critical need to work on holistic definitions, to take molecular biology and morphology and a better fossil record. I mean, I wouldn't think it's a bad idea if we actually went back to zero, pretended that all the fossils today were found at the same time right now with all the information we had, and we worked out, because we also suffer historical bias. Because the Tong child was found first and Neanderthals were found in Europe and Homo erectus was found in Asia, we create this biased story based on a few things that were in front of us, when we have a vastly better record now and should actually probably scrap all that and start over again.
We have one more question from colleagues on Zoom. Some anonymous guests who asked whether you also found some stone tools.
I'm not going to answer that.
Maybe we take it as an answer.
Which might be an answer in and of itself. I'm not going to answer that right now. We
could stop the recording for the.
We have some potential artifacts that are understudied. How about that for an answer?
Sounds promising. Sounds exciting and promising, and maybe that's a good final word. Unless Francesco would like to ask a question or comment something.
Yeah. Again, one could go on forever. I think. I've been always amazed by the use that you have done of Google Maps, and I think our X-rays gave a major contribution. Where do you see other major technological breakthrough? For example, a satellite exploration can be pushed much more into the direction of this kind of studies. What is our level of understanding of evolution of the planet Earth surface over, let's say, scales of hundred thousands of years? I think that's another completely new exploration discipline that I've never really heard about in my university studies, especially if it's somehow relevant for paleoanthropology discipline.
I think you're absolutely right, Francesco. If I had to pick where the gigantic future breakthroughs are going to be, they're going to be in visualization technologies, whether they be at this level or whether they be from drones or from hyperspectral studies or satellites or or different light studies, or augmented virtual reality being used as an exploration tool combined with robots. And you know, we're in the infancy of that. And yet you see colleagues like Sarah Parkek, who is an Egyptologist, and colleagues working in South America that are making discoveries that lie in front of us, but we don't have the visual angular capacity to see them, that are transforming our ideas of ancient civilizations on broad levels and down to individuals. Those technologies we're applying to discovery, using drones to fly different types of devices, LiDAR, and these type of remarkable mapping devices that you can, you know, that'll all probably be on your iPhone in 5 years, and you'll be able to use. So I do think one of the major areas that's going to advance exploration and real production of real-time knowledge, like the case of the Mayan cities, for example, is going to be in all the modalities of visualization, all the way from light sources, neutron sources, X-rays, right through to the hyperspectral realm and visualization on that.
Thank you. So as Francesco said, and you just demonstrated, we could go on for hours. And unfortunately, we have to stop at some point. Okay, well, Francesco, you're the boss, you decided.
So this is not a question, is a comment. It's a double comment. The first one is that I think that Grenoble has contributed with our X-rays to your research, but through your talk, I have discovered that Grenoble enters twice, because most of the equipment that your team is using is also being fabricated in Grenoble by a company that is called Petzl, right?
That's right.
And the second comment is thank you very much, because you know, this discovery, I think, makes us really feel that we are all coming from something in common, and I think this is really great, and it's fantastic.
Well, thank you very much.
Let's give Lee a good applause.
Thank you very much.